The moment Americans arrive in Canada, there's always this brief pause, a moment where something feels familiar, yet noticeably different. It's not the weather or the accents or even the speed of life. It's the atmosphere. Americans often describe their first steps in Canada as stepping into a version of North America that feels just slightly shifted. Calmer, softer, and unexpectedly thoughtful. And the first few minutes are enough to make them realize they're not in the US anymore. Today, we're breaking down the subtle things Americans pick up on instantly when they arrive in Canada. These aren't the big, obvious differences that travel guides mention. They're the small, sensory details that hit you the moment you step off the plane or cross the border. It's the way people move through airport terminals, the tone of announcements over the speakers, the pace at which customs officers speak, and even the quality of silence in between interactions. Americans expect Canada to feel like a northern extension of home, but within minutes, they realize it operates on a completely different frequency. The shock isn't dramatic, it's gentle, almost disorienting in its subtlety, and that's exactly what makes it so memorable. By the end of your first day in Canada, you won't be able to pinpoint exactly what changed, but you'll know something definitely did. One of the earliest things Americans notice is how people behave in public spaces. The tone is quieter, conversations feel softer, and strangers move with a kind of unspoken awareness of each other. It's not that Canadians don't talk, they do, but there's a gentleness in how they do it. Americans who are used to louder, more expressive environments immediately pick up on this softer social energy. It's one of the first cultural shifts they feel without anyone pointing it out. In American airports, train stations, and public squares, voices naturally rise. People laugh loudly, call out to friends across rooms, speak on their phones without lowering their volume. But in Canada, even busy public spaces feel acoustically restrained. People keep their conversations contained, their laughter moderate, and their phone calls brief and quiet. It's not that Canadians are shy or cold. They're simply mindful of shared space in a way that feels almost instinctive. Americans notice this immediately because it contrasts so sharply with what they're used to. They find themselves unconsciously lowering their own voices to match the environment, feeling almost too loud even when speaking at a normal volume. This social quietness isn't oppressive, it's just present, like an invisible etiquette that everyone follows without needing to discuss it. And for Americans, this is often the very first cultural difference they consciously register, sometimes within minutes of arrival. Then comes the way the streets feel. Whether it's Toronto, Vancouver, or even smaller towns, Americans are surprised by the sense of order. People lining up without being told, doors being held open without hesitation, and small courtesies that seem to happen naturally. It's these little moments that stand out the quickest. And by the way, if you're enjoying this breakdown of culture differences, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because we explore global habits and cultures every single day on this channel. Now, let's continue. Americans notice that pedestrians wait for walk signals even when no cars are coming, that people form orderly queues without anyone enforcing them, and that strangers acknowledge each other with small nods or brief smiles. These behaviors feel automatic in Canada, but to Americans, they stand out as remarkably disciplined and considerate. In many U.S. cities, jaywalking is common. Lines can be chaotic, and personal space is often negotiated rather than respected. But in Canada, there's an unspoken social contract that everyone seems to honor. Americans also notice how clean the streets are. Less litter, fewer broken sidewalks, and public spaces that feel genuinely maintained. Even graffiti, when present, often feels more artistic than destructive. The overall impression is one of collective care, as if everyone takes personal responsibility for shared spaces. This sense of civic mindfulness creates an atmosphere that feels safe, organized, and surprisingly peaceful compared to the urban chaos many Americans are accustomed to navigating daily. Many Americans notice how often they hear sorry, even when nothing happened. Canadians apologize as a reflex, not because they're guilty, but because it keeps social interaction smooth. This catches Americans off guard almost immediately. Some say it feels refreshing, others say it feels almost too polite, but everyone agrees. It's one of the first cultural habits that stands out within hours of arriving. Americans bump into someone in a crowded space and the other person says sorry. Americans hold a door and the person walking through says sorry for making them wait. Someone asks for directions and apologizes for interrupting before even asking the question. At first, Americans find this charming and amusing. They might even joke about the stereotype coming true. But the longer they spend in Canada, the more they realize this constant apologizing serves a deeper social function. It diffuses tension before it can build, acknowledges shared space and mutual consideration, and creates a buffer of politeness that makes everyday interactions feel less confrontational and more cooperative. Americans also notice that Canadians are helpful in understated ways, offering directions without being asked, moving aside without needing prompting, and generally anticipating the needs of others in public spaces. This proactive politeness feels different from American friendliness, which tends to be louder and more direct. Canadian kindness is quieter, more subtle, and somehow more universal. It's extended to everyone equally rather than selectively based on personal connection or mood. Another thing that surprises Americans is how clean and organized Canadian cities feel. Trash cans are everywhere, streets feel less chaotic, and even busy downtown areas have an underlying calmness. Americans often compare it to their own cities and immediately feel the difference. Not in scale, but in atmosphere. Canada has a quiet structure that visitors notice before they even check into their hotel. The architecture tends to be less flashy, the signage less overwhelming, and the overall visual noise significantly reduced compared to major American cities. There are fewer billboards screaming for attention, fewer aggressive advertisements, and less commercial clutter competing for your eyes. Public transportation feels cleaner and more reliable. Subways and buses run on time, stations are well maintained, and passengers follow unspoken rules about personal space and noise levels. Even traffic feels different. Cars don't honk as aggressively, drivers yield more readily, and road rage seems less prevalent. Americans notice that parking lots are orderly, that bike lanes are actually respected, and that pedestrian crossings feel genuinely safe. The parks are greener, better maintained, and more actively used by people of all ages. Everything feels intentionally designed for livability rather than just functionality. This creates an urban experience that feels less stressful and more human-scaled, even in Canada's largest metropolitan areas. Americans often describe it as feeling like their cities, but with the volume turned down and the edges softened. Americans also notice the small lifestyle details, the metric system on signs, the bilingual labels in English and French, the universal healthcare posters in clinics, even milk sold in bags in certain provinces. These little quirks blend together into a moment where an American thinks, okay, I'm definitely somewhere new now. It's not dramatic, it's subtle, but it's unforgettable. Speed limit signs show kilometers instead of miles, forcing Americans to do mental math or simply drive more cautiously. Temperatures are in Celsius, which means weather conversations require translation. Product labels switch between English and French, creating a visual reminder that Canada embraces linguistic duality in ways the US doesn't. Americans notice that prescription medications cost a fraction of what they'd pay at home, that doctors' visits don't come with bills, and that healthcare operates on fundamentally different principles. They see the queen or king on currency, notice that coins include $1 and $2 denominations, and realize that paper money is actually made of polymer and feels almost plastic. Cultural references in media, advertising, and conversation include Canadian-specific content that Americans don't immediately recognize. Hockey takes precedence over football, Tim Hortons has cult-like status, and certain brands that dominate Canadian life are completely unknown south of the border. These accumulated details create a distinct sense of place that Americans recognize as uniquely Canadian, different enough to feel foreign but similar enough to remain comfortable and navigable. So while Canada and the United States share a border and much of their history, the feeling of stepping into Canada is something Americans recognize instantly. It's the mix of quiet courtesy, small habits, and cultural rhythms that make the country stand out from the very first moment. And if you've ever visited Canada, you know that first impression stays with you. If you enjoyed this look into Canadian life, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me what you noticed first when you arrived in Canada. Every story helps us understand the world a little better. The beauty of these first impressions is that they reveal something important about both countries. Not that one is better than the other, but that they've developed different approaches to shared spaces, social interaction, and daily life. Americans who visit Canada often return home seeing their own country with fresh eyes, suddenly aware of patterns they never noticed before. They realize how loud American public spaces are, how individualistic American social behavior can be, and how different life feels when collective consideration takes precedence over individual expression. Whether you're planning your first trip to Canada, considering a move, or just curious about cultural differences, understanding these subtle first impressions helps prepare you for the experience. Canada won't shock you with dramatic contrasts, but it will surprise you with gentle differences that accumulate into something distinctly and memorably Canadian. So share your own observations below, subscribe for more cultural explorations, and let's keep discovering what makes each place unique and worth understanding.